All right, so I've gone ahead and filled out our feeding table a little bit more, put a little more data in there. And as you can see, each record has the head ID associated with the feeding that was done, who did it, the date, the time, the amount. Um, so one thing to kind of point out here, if you're looking at this feeding table, I want to kind of start talking about how tables relate to each other. So for instance, in our inventory table, going back to that, we have one record. So like a row of data is what we call a record. We have one record per animal that's been in our pet store. This is unique to them. They're only going to be in this table one time. This white hamster named Buster is only going to be in our table once. He's going to be pet ID 1 forever. Even after we've already sold him, and he's long gone, he's still always going to be in our database as pet number 1. Same with the cat. Black cat Fluffy is a unique record. ID number 2 will be that way forever in our table. So if I go to the feeding table now, and let's for instance, look at pet number 2. We'll go back to the black cat. So you see I have a record here for pet ID number 2 being fed at 12:05 p.m. But then you also see here that I also have another record for pet ID number 2 being fed in the evening, 6:15 p.m. and even by a different employee number 2. So one thing to point out when you're working in tables, if you kind of want to see the data a little more clearly instead of having to sort through all this, all the information and trying to say how many times was pet number 2 on here or such, you can always, within the field itself, if you can right click on it and you get some options. Like for instance, you can say show me every record where the pet ID value is 2. So you see when I do this, I can see all the times that the black cat was fed. And another thing to know here is remember where we said on the inventory table, pet ID 2 will only exist here one time. This is the only time that they'll ever be here. The black cat Fluffy, this exact cat, will never also be on this table with another record. So that's their unique identifier. But on the feeding table, this pet ID can show up many times and will, because you're going to feed them every day, probably multiple times a day. So when you have that scenario where you have one table where this record will only exist one time, and this table where that same ID will show up many times, it's what we call a one-to-many relationship. That's a database term you'll hear frequently. There'll also be tables that may relate what we call a one-to-one. So I don't know if we have a good example now, but you could have where two tables may relate on a certain piece of data, but it's a guarantee that that ID number will only be in each table one time. It's a one-to-one relationship versus in this case, we have what we call a one-to-many. That's important to know when you start setting up actual relationships within Microsoft Access. You can specify that a relationship between tables is a one-to-one or one-to-many. And in many cases, you can also have a many-to-many, where you have two tables where the same ID can be referenced multiple times, many to many. So I just wanted to kind of bring that up. That's our introduction to the different types of relationships. Once again, there's a one-to-one, a one-to-many, or a many-to-many.